Second essay, Guilt, Bad Conscience, and the Like. Part 2. 13. To return to our subject, namely punishment, we must make consequently a double distinction. First, the relatively permanent element, the custom, the act, the drama, a certain rigid sequence of method and procedure. On the other hand, the fluid element, the meaning, the end, the expectation which is attached to the operation of any such procedure. At this point we immediately assume, per analogiam, in accordance with the theory of the historic method, which we have elaborated above, that the procedure itself is something older and earlier than its utilization and punishment, that this utilization was introduced and interpreted into the procedure, which had existed for a long time but whose employment had another meaning. In short, that the case is different from that hitherto supposed by our naive genealogists of morals and of law, who thought that the procedure was invented for the purpose of punishment, in the same way that the hand had been previously thought to have been invented for the purpose of grasping. With regard to the other element in punishment, its fluid element, its meaning, the idea of punishment at a very late stage of civilization, for instance contemporary Europe, is not content with manifesting merely one meaning, but manifests a whole synthesis of meanings. The past general history of punishment, the history of its employment for the most diverse ends, crystallizes eventually into a kind of unity, which is difficult to analyze into its parts, and which, it is necessary to emphasize, absolutely defies definition. It is nowadays impossible to say definitely the precise reason for punishment. All ideas in which a whole process is promiscuously comprehended elude definition. It is only that to which has no history, which can be defined. At an earlier stage, on the contrary, that synthesis of meanings appears much less rigid and much more elastic. We can realize how in each individual case the elements of the synthesis change their value and their position, so that now one element and now another stands out and predominates over the others. Nay, in certain cases one element, perhaps the end of deterrence, seems to eliminate all the rest. At any rate, so as to give some idea of the uncertain supplementary and accidental nature of the meaning of punishment and of the manner in which one identical procedure can be employed and adapted for the most diametrically opposed objects, I will, at this point, give a scheme that has suggested itself to me, a scheme itself based on a comparatively small and accidental material. Punishment, as rendering the criminal harmless and incapable of further injury. Punishment, as compensation for the injury sustained by the injured party, in any form whatsoever, including the form of sentimental compensation. Punishment, as an isolation of that which disturbs the equilibrium, so as to prevent the further spreading of that disturbance. Punishment as a means of inspiring fear of those who determine and execute the punishment. Punishment as a kind of compensation for the advantages which the wrongdoer has up to that time enjoyed, for example, when he is utilized as a slave in the mines. Punishment as the elimination of an element of decay, sometimes of a whole branch according to Chinese laws, consequently as a means to the purification of the race, or the preservation of a social type. Punishment as a festival, as the violent oppression and humiliation of an enemy that has at long last been subdued. Punishment as a mnemonic, whether for him who suffers the punishment, the so-called correction, or for the witness of its administration. Punishment as the payment of a fee stipulated for by the power which protects the evil doer from the excesses of revenge. Punishment as a compromise with the natural phenomenon of revenge, insofar as revenge is still maintained and claimed as a privilege by the stronger races. Punishment as a declaration and measure of war against an enemy of peace, of law, of order, of authority, who is fought by society with the weapons which war provides, as a spirit dangerous to the community, as a breaker of the contract on which the community is based, as a rebel, a traitor, and a breaker of the peace. 14. This list is certainly not complete. It is obvious that punishment is overloaded with utilities of all kinds. This makes it all the more permissible to eliminate one supposed utility, which passes, at any rate in the popular mind, for the most essential utility, and which is just what even now provides the strongest support for that faith in punishment which is nowadays for many reasons tottering. Punishment is supposed to have the value of exciting in the guilty the consciousness of guilt. In punishment is sought the proper instrumentum of that psychic reaction which has become known as bad conscience, remorse. But this theory is even, from the point of view of the present, a violation of reality and psychology. And how much more so is the case when we have to deal with the longest period of man's history, his primitive history. Genuine remorse is certainly extremely rare among wrongdoers and the victims of punishment. Prisons and houses of correction are not the soil on which this worm of remorse pullulates for choice. This is the unanimous opinion of all conscientious observers, who in many cases arrive at such a judgment with enough reluctance and against their own personal wishes. Speaking generally, punishment hardens and numbs. It produces concentration. It sharpens the consciousness of alienation. It strengthens the power of resistance. When it happens that it breaks the man's energy and brings about a piteous prostration and abjectness, such a result is certainly even less salutary than the average effect of punishment, which is characterized by a harsh and sinister doggedness. The thought of those prehistoric millennia brings us to the unhesitating conclusion that it was simply through punishment that the evolution of the consciousness of guilt was most forcibly retarded. At any rate, in the victims of the punishing power. In particular, let us not underestimate the extent to which, by the very sight of the judicial and executive procedure, the wrongdoer is himself prevented from feeling that his deed, the character of his act, is intrinsically reprehensible. For he sees clearly the same kind of acts practiced in the service of justice, and then called good, and practiced with good conscience. Acts such as espionage, trickery, bribery, trapping, the whole intriguing and insidious art of the policeman informer. The whole system in fact manifested in the different kinds of punishment, a system not excused by passion, but based on principle, of robbing, oppressing, insulting, imprisoning, racking, murdering. All this he sees treated by his judges, not as acts meriting censure and condemnation in themselves, but only in a particular context and application. It was not on this soil that grew the bad conscience, that most sinister and interesting plant of our earthly vegetation. In point of fact, throughout the most lengthy period, no suggestion of having to do with a guilty man manifested itself in the consciousness of the man who judged and punished. One had merely to deal with an author of an injury, an irresponsible piece of fate. And the man himself, on whom the punishment subsequently fell like a piece of fate, was occasioned no more of an inner pain than would be occasioned by the sudden approach of some uncalculated event, some terrible natural catastrophe, a rushing, crushing avalanche against which there is no resistance. 15. This truth came insidiously enough to the consciousness of Spinoza, to the disgust of his commentators who, like Kuno Fischer for instance, give themselves no end of trouble to misunderstand him on this point. When one afternoon, as he sat raking up who knows what memory, he indulged in the question of what was really left for him personally of the celebrated morsus conscientiae, Spinoza, who had relegated good and evil to the sphere of human imagination, and indignantly defended the honour of his free God against those blasphemers who affirmed that God did everything sub ratione boni, but this was tantamount to subordinating God to fate, and would really be the greatest of all absurdities. For Spinoza the world had returned again to that innocence in which it lay before the discovery of the bad conscience. What, then, had happened to the morsus conscientiae? The antithesis of gaudium, said he at last to himself. A sadness accompanied by the recollection of a past event which had turned out contrary to all expectation. Ethics, Book 3, Proposition 18, Scholium 1, 2. Evildoers have throughout thousands of years felt when overtaken by punishment exactly like Spinoza on the subject of their offence. Here is something which went wrong, contrary to my anticipation. Not, I ought not to have done this. They submitted themselves to punishment, just as one submits oneself to his disease, to a misfortune, or to death, with that stubborn and resigned fatalism which gives the Russians, for instance, even nowadays the advantage over us Westerners, in the handling of life. If after that period there was a critique of action, the criterion was prudence, The real effect of punishment is unquestionably chiefly to be found in a sharpening of the sense of prudence, in a lengthening of the memory, in a will to adopt more of a policy of caution, suspicion, and secrecy, in the recognition that there are many things which are unquestionably beyond one's capacity, in a kind of improvement in self-criticism. The broad effects which can be obtained by punishment in man and beast are the increase of fear, the sharpening of the sense of cunning, the mastery of the desires. So it is that punishment tames man, but does not make him better. It would be more correct even to go so far as to assert the contrary. Injury makes a man cunning, says a popular proverb. So far as it makes him cunning, it makes him also bad. Fortunately, it often enough makes him stupid. 16. At this juncture I cannot avoid trying to give a tentative and provisional expression to my own hypothesis concerning the origin of the bad conscience. It is difficult to make it fully appreciated, and it requires continuous meditation, attention, and digestion. I regard the bad conscience as the serious illness which man was bound to contract under the stress of the most radical change which he had ever experienced. That change when he found himself finally imprisoned within the pale of society and of peace. Just like the plight of the water animals, when they were compelled either to become land animals or to perish, so was the plight of these half-animals, perfectly adapted as they were to the savage life of war, prowling and adventure. Suddenly all their instincts were rendered worthless and switched off. Henceforward they had to walk on their feet, carry themselves, whereas heretofore they had been carried into the water. A terrible heaviness oppressed them. They found themselves clumsy in obeying the simplest directions. Confronted with this new and unknown world, they had no longer their old guides, the regulative instincts that had led them unconsciously to safety. They were reduced, were those unhappy creatures, to thinking, inferring, calculating, putting together causes and results, reduced to that poorest and most erratic organ of theirs, their consciousness. I do not believe there was ever in the world such a feeling of misery, such a leaden discomfort. Further, those old instincts had not immediately ceased their demands. Only it was difficult and rarely possible to gratify them. Speaking broadly, they were compelled to satisfy themselves by new and, as it were, hole and corner methods. All instincts which do not find a vent without turn inwards. This is what I mean by the growing internalization of man. Consequently, we have the first growth in man of what subsequently was called his soul. The whole inner world, originally as thin as if it had been stretched between two layers of skin, burst apart and expanded proportionately, and obtained depth, breadth, and height. When man's external outlet became obstructed, these terrible bulwarks with which the social organization protected itself against the old instincts of freedom, punishments belong preeminently to these bulwarks, brought it about that all those instincts of wild, free, prowling man became turned backwards against man himself. Enmity, cruelty, the delight in persecution, in surprises, change, destruction, the turning all these instincts against their own possessors, this is the origin of the bad conscience. It was man who, lacking external enemies and obstacles, and imprisoned as he was in the oppressive narrowness and monotony of custom, in his own impatience, lacerated, persecuted, gnawed, frightened, and ill-treated himself. It was this animal in the cage of the tamer, which beat itself against the bars of its cage. It was this being who, pining and yearning for that desert home of which it had been deprived, was compelled to create out of itself an adventure, a torture chamber, a hazardous and perilous desert. It was this fool, this homesick and desperate prisoner, who invented the bad conscience. But thereby he introduced that most grave and sinister illness, from which mankind has not yet recovered, the suffering of man from the disease called man, as the result of a violent breaking from his animal past, the result, as it were, of a spasmodic plunge into a new environment and new conditions of existence, the result of a declaration of war against the old instincts, which up to that time had been the staple of his power, his joy, his formidableness. Let us immediately add that this fact of an animal ego turning against itself, taking part against itself, produced in the world so novel, profound, unheard of, problematic, inconsistent, and pregnant a phenomenon, that the aspect of the world was radically altered thereby. In sooth, only divine spectators could have appreciated the drama that then began, and whose end baffles conjecture as yet. A drama too subtle, too wonderful, too paradoxical to warrant its undergoing a nonsensical and unheeded performance on some random grotesque planet. Henceforth man is to be counted as one of the most unexpected and sensational lucky shots in the game of the big baby of Heraclitus. Whether he be called Zeus or Chance, he awakens on his behalf the interest, excitement, hope, almost the confidence of his being the harbinger and forerunner of something, of man being no end, but only a stage, an interlude, a bridge, a great promise. 17. It is primarily involved in this hypothesis of the origin of bad conscience, that alteration was no gradual and no voluntary alteration, and that it did not manifest itself as an organic adaptation to new conditions, but as a break, a jump, a necessity, an inevitable fate, against which there was no resistance and never a spark of resentment. And secondarily, that the fitting of a hitherto unchecked and amorphous population into a fixed form, starting as it had done in an act of violence, could only be accomplished by acts of violence and nothing else. That the oldest state appeared consequently as a ghastly tyranny, a grinding, ruthless piece of machinery, which went on working till this raw material of a semi-animal populace was not only thoroughly kneaded and elastic, but also moulded. I used the word state. My meaning is self-evident, namely, a herd of blond beasts of prey, a race of conquerors and masters, which with all its warlike organization and all its organizing power pounces with its terrible claws on a population, in numbers possibly tremendously superior, but as yet formless, as yet nomad. Such is the origin of the state. That fantastic theory that makes it begin with a contract is, I think, disposed of. He who can command, he who is a master by nature, he who comes on the scene forceful in deed and gesture, what has he to do with contracts? Such beings defy calculation, they come like fate, without cause, reason, notice, excuse. They are there as the lightning is there, too, terrible, too sudden, too convincing, too different, to be personally even hated. Their work is an instinctive creating and impressing of forms. They are the most involuntary, unconscious artists that there are. Their appearance produces instantaneously a scheme of sovereignty which is live, in which the functions are partitioned and apportioned, in which above all no part is received or finds a place, until pregnant with a meaning in regard to the whole. They are ignorant of the meaning of guilt, responsibility, consideration, are these born organizers. In them predominates that terrible artist egoism, that gleams like brass, and that knows itself justified to all eternity in its work, even as a mother in her child. It is not in them that there grew the bad conscience, that is elementary, but it would not have grown without them. Repulsive growth as it was, it would be missing, had not a tremendous quantity of freedom been expelled from the world by the stress of their hammer strokes, their artist violence, or been at any rate made invisible and as it were latent. This instinct of freedom forced into being latent, it is already clear, this instinct of freedom forced back, trodden back, imprisoned within itself, and finally only able to vent and relief in itself, this, only this, is the beginning of the bad conscience. 18. Beware of thinking lightly of this phenomenon, by reason of its initial painful ugliness. At bottom, it is the same active force which is at work on a more grandiose scale in those potent artists and organizers, and build states, where here internally on a smaller and pettier scale, and with a retrogressive tendency, makes itself a bad conscience in the labyrinth of the beast, to use Goethe's phrase, and which builds negative ideals. It is, I repeat, that identical instinct of freedom, to use my own language, the will to power. Only the material on which this force with all its constructive and tyrannous nature is let loose, is here man himself. this whole old animal self, and not, as in the case of that more grandiose and sensational phenomenon, the other man, other men. This secret self-tyranny, this cruelty of the artist, this delight in giving a form to oneself as a piece of difficult, refractory and suffering material, in burning in a will, a critique, a contradiction, a contempt, a negation. This sinister and ghastly labour of love on the part of a soul, whose will is cloven in two within itself, which makes itself suffer from delight in the infliction of suffering, this wholly active bad conscience, as finally, as one already anticipates, true fountainhead as it is of idealism and imagination, produced an abundance of novel and amazing beauty and affirmation, and perhaps has really been the first to give birth to beauty at all. What would beauty be, forsooth, if its contradiction had not first been presented to consciousness, if the ugly had not first said to himself, I am ugly? At any rate, after this hint the problem of how far idealism and beauty can be traced in such opposite ideals as selflessness, self-denial, self-sacrifice, becomes less problematical. And indubitably, in future, we shall certainly know the real and original character of the delight experienced by the selfless, the self-denying, the self-sacrificing. This delight is a phase of cruelty, so much provisionally for the origin of altruism as a moral value, and the marking out the ground from which this value has grown. It is only the bad conscience, only the will for self-abuse, that provides the necessary conditions for the existence of altruism as a value. 19. Undoubtedly the bad conscience is an illness, but an illness as pregnancy is an illness. If we search out the conditions under which this illness reaches its most terrible and sublime zenith, we shall see what really first brought about its entry into the world. But to do this we must take a long breath, and we must first of all go back once again to an earlier point of view. The relation at civil law of the ower to his creditor, which has already been discussed in detail, has been interpreted once again, and indeed in a manner which historically is exceedingly remarkable and suspicious, into a relationship which is perhaps more incomprehensible to us moderns than to any other era, that is, into the relationship of the existing generation of its ancestors. Within the original tribal association, we are talking of primitive times, each living generation recognizes a legal obligation towards the earlier generation, and particularly towards the earliest, which founded the family. And this is something much more than a mere sentimental obligation, the existence of which during the longest period of man's history is by no means indisputable. There prevails in them the conviction that it is only thanks to sacrifices and efforts of their ancestors that the race persists at all, and that this has to be paid back to them by sacrifices and services. Thus is recognized the owing of a debt, which accumulates continually by reason of these ancestors never ceasing in their subsequent life as potent spirits to secure by their power new privileges and advantages to the race. Gratis, perchance? But there is no gratis for that raw and mean-souled age. What return can be made? Sacrifice, at first nourishment in its crudest sense, festivals, temples, tributes of veneration, above all, obedience. Since all customs are, qua works of the ancestors, equally their precepts and commands, are the ancestors ever given enough? This suspicion remains and grows. From time to time it extorts a great wholesale ransom, something monstrous in the way of repayment of the creditor, the notorious sacrifice of the firstborn, for example, blood, human blood in any case. The fear of ancestors and their power, the consciousness of owing debts to them, necessarily increases, according to this kind of logic, in the exact proportion that the race itself increases, that the race itself becomes more victorious, more independent, more honoured, more feared. This, and not the contrary, is the fact. Each step towards race decay, all disastrous events, all symptoms of degeneration, of approaching disintegration, always diminish the fear of the founder's spirit, and whittle away the idea of his sagacity, providence, and potent presence. Conceive this crude kind of logic carried to its climax. It follows that the ancestors of the most powerful races must, through the growing fear that they exercise on the imaginations, grow themselves into monstrous dimensions, and become relegated to the gloom of a divine mystery that transcends imagination. The ancestor becomes at last necessarily transfigured into a god. Perhaps this is the very origin of the gods, that is, an origin from fear. And those who feel bound to add, but from piety also, will have difficulty in maintaining this theory, with regard to the primeval and longest period of the human race. And, of course, this is even more the case as regard the middle period, the formative period of the aristocratic races which have given back with interest to their founders, the ancestors, heroes, gods, of all those qualities which in the meanwhile have appeared in themselves, that is, the aristocratic qualities. We will later on glance again at the ennobling and promotion of the gods, which of course is totally distinct from their sanctification. Let us now provisionally follow to its end the course of the whole of this development of the consciousness of owing. 20. According to the teaching of history, the consciousness of owing debts to the deity by no means came to an end with the decay of the clan organization of society, just as mankind has inherited the ideas of good and bad from the race nobility, together with its fundamental tendency towards establishing social distinctions. So with the heritage of the racial and tribal gods, it has also inherited the incubus of debts, as yet unpaid, and the desire to discharge them. The transition is effected by those large populations of slaves and bondsmen, who, whether through compulsion or through submission and mimicry, have accommodated themselves to the religion of their masters. Through this channel these inherited tendencies inundate the world. The feeling of owing a debt to the deity has grown continuously for several centuries, always in the same proportion in which the idea of God and the consciousness of God have grown and become exalted among mankind. The whole history of ethnic fights, victories, reconciliations, amalgamations, everything in fact which precedes the eventual classing of all social elements in each great race synthesis, are mirrored in the hodgepodge genealogy of their gods, in the legends of their fights, victories, and reconciliations. Progress towards universal empires invariably means progress towards universal deities. Despotism, with its subjugation of the independent nobility, always paves the way for some system or other of monotheism. The appearance of the Christian God, as the record God up to this time, has for that very reason brought equally into the world the record amount of guilt consciousness. Granted that we have gradually started on the reverse movement, there is no little probability in this deduction, based on the continuous decay in the belief of the Christian God, to the effect that there also already exists a considerable decay in the human consciousness of owing, of ought. In fact, we cannot shut our eyes to the prospect of the complete and eventual triumph of atheism freeing mankind from all this feeling of obligation to their origin, their causa prima. Atheism and a kind of second innocence complement and supplement each other. 21. So much for my rough and preliminary sketch of the interrelation of ideas ought, and duty with the postulates of religion. I have intentionally shelved up to the present the actual moralization of these ideas, their being pushed back into the conscience, or more precisely the interweaving of the bad conscience with the idea of God. And at the end of the last paragraph use language to the effect that this moralization did not exist, and that consequently these ideas had necessarily come to an end by reason of what had happened to their hypothesis, the credence in our creditor, in God. The actual facts differ terribly from this theory. It is with the moralization of the ideas ought and duty, and with their being pushed back into the bad conscience, that comes the first actual attempts to reverse the direction of the development we have just described, or at any rate to arrest its evolution. It is just at this juncture that the very hope of an eventual redemption has to put itself once and for all into the prison of pessimism. It is at this juncture that the eye has to recoil and rebound in despair from off an adamantine impossibility. It is at this juncture that the ideas guilt and duty have to turn backwards. Turn backwards against whom? There is no doubt about it, primarily against the ower, in whom the bad conscience now establishes itself, eats, extends, and grows like a polypus throughout its length and breadth, all with such virulence, that at last, with the impossibility of paying the debt, there becomes conceived the idea of the impossibility of paying the penalty, the thought of its inexpiability, the idea of eternal punishment. Finally, too, it turns against the creditor, whether found in the causa prima of man, the origin of the human race, its sire, who henceforth becomes burdened with a curse, Adam, original sin, determination of the will, or in nature from whose womb man springs, and on whom the responsibility for the principle of evil is now cast, diabolization of nature, or in existence generally, on this logic an absolute white elephant, with which mankind is landed, the nihilistic flight from life, the demand for nothingness, or for the opposite of existence, for some other existence, Buddhism and the like, till suddenly we stand before that paradoxical and awful expedient through which a tortured humanity has found a temporary alleviation, that stroke of genius called Christianity, God personally immolating himself for the debt of man, God paying himself personally out of a pound of his own flesh, God is the one being who can deliver man from what man had become unable to deliver himself, the creditor playing scapegoat for his debtor, from love, can you believe it? From love of his debtor. 22. The reader will already have conjectured what took place on the stage and behind the scenes of this drama. That will for self-torture, that inverted cruelty of the animal man, who, turned subjective and scared into introspection, encaged as he was in the state, as part of his taming process, invented the bad conscience so as to hurt himself, after the natural outlet for this will to hurt became blocked. In other words, this man of the bad conscience exploited the religious hypothesis, so as to carry his martyrdom to the ghastliest pitch of agonized intensity. Owing something to God, this thought becomes his instrument of torture. He apprehends in God the most extreme antithesis he can find to his own characteristic and ineradicable animal instincts. He himself gives a new interpretation to these animal instincts as being against what he owes to God, as enmity, rebellion, and revolt against the Lord, or the Father, the Sire, the beginning of the world. He places himself between the horns of the dilemma, God and devil. Every negation which he is inclined to utter to himself, to the nature, naturalness, and reality of his being, he whips into an ejaculation of yes, uttering it as something existing, living, efficient, as being God, as the holiness of God, the judgment of God, as the hangmanship of God, as transcendence, as eternity, as unending torment, as hell, as infinity of punishment and guilt. This is a kind of madness of the will in the sphere of psychological cruelty which is absolutely unparalleled. Man's will to find himself guilty and blameworthy to the point of inexpiability, his will to think of himself as punished, without the punishment ever being able to balance the guilt, his will to infect and to poison the fundamental basis of the universe with the problem of punishment and guilt, in order to cut off once and for all any escape out of his labyrinth of fixed ideas, his will for rearing an ideal, that of the holy God, face to face, with which he can have tangible proof of his own unworthiness. Alas for this mad, melancholy beast man! What fantasies invade it, what paroxysms of perversity, hysterical senselessness, and mental bestiality break out immediately, at the very slightest check on its being the beast of action. All this is excessively interesting, but at the same time tainted with a black, gloomy, enervating melancholy, so that a forcible veto must be invoked against looking too long into these abysses. Here is disease, indubitably, the most ghastly diseases that has as yet played havoc among men, and he who can still hear, but man turns now deaf ears to such sounds, how in this night of torment and nonsense there has rung out the cry of love, the cry of the most passionate ecstasy, of redemption in love, he turns away gripped as by an invincible horror. In man there is so much that is ghastly. Too long has the world been a madhouse. 23. Let this suffice once for all concerning the origin of the holy God. The fact that in itself the conception of gods is not bound to lead necessarily to this degradation of the imagination, a temporary representation of whose vagaries we felt bound to give. The fact that there exists nobler methods of utilizing the inventions of gods than in this self-crucifixion and self-degradation of man, in which the last 2,000 years of Europe have been past masters. These facts can fortunately be still perceived from every glance that we cast at the Grecian gods, these mirrors of noble and grandiose men, in which the animal in man felt itself defiled, and did not devour itself in subjective frenzy. These Greeks long utilized their gods as simple buffers against the bad conscience, so that they could continue to enjoy their freedom of soul. This, of course, is diametrically opposed to Christianity's theory of its God. They went very far on this principle, did these splendid and lion-hearted children. And there is no lesser authority than that of the Homeric Zeus for making them realize occasionally that they are taking life too casually. "Wonderful," he says on one occasion, it had to do with the case of Aegisthus, a very bad case indeed. "Wonderful how they grumble, the mortals against the immortals. Only from us, they presume, comes evil, but in their folly fashion they, spite of fate, the doom of their own disaster." Yet the reader will note and observe that this Olympian spectator and judge is far from being angry with them and thinking evil of them as on this score. "How foolish they are," so thinks he of the misdeeds of mortals, and folly, impudence, a little brain disturbance, and nothing more, are what the Greeks, even of their strongest, bravest period, have admitted to be the ground of much that is evil and fatal. Folly, not sin, do you understand? But even this brain disturbance was a problem. Come, how is it even possible? How could it have really got into brains like ours, the brains of men of aristocratic ancestry, of men of fortune, of men of good natural endowments, of men of the best society, of men of nobility and virtue? This was the question that for century on century the aristocratic Greek put to himself when confronted with every, to him incomprehensible, outrage and sacrilege with which one of his peers had polluted himself. "It must be that a god had infatuated him," he would say, at last, nodding his head. This solution is typical of the Greeks. Accordingly, the gods in those times subserved the functions of justifying man to a certain extent even in evil. In those days they took upon themselves not the punishment, but, what is more noble, the guilt. 24. I conclude with 3 queries, as you will see. Is an ideal actually set up here, or is one pulled down? I am perhaps asked. But have ye sufficiently asked yourselves how dear a payment has the setting up of every ideal in the world exacted? To achieve that consummation, how much truth must always be traduced and misunderstood? How many lies must be sanctified? How much conscience has got to be disturbed? How many pounds of God have got to be sacrificed every time? To enable a sanctuary to be set up, a sanctuary has got to be destroyed. That is a law. Show me an instance of where it has not been fulfilled. We modern men, we inherit the immemorial tradition of vivisecting the conscience, and practicing cruelty to our animal selves. That is the sphere of our most protracted training, perhaps of our artistic prowess, at any rate of our dilettantism and our perverted taste. Man has for too long regarded his natural proclivities with an evil eye, so that eventually they have become, in his system, affiliated with a bad conscience. A converse endeavour would be intrinsically feasible, but who is strong enough to attempt it? Namely, to affiliate to the bad conscience all those unnatural proclivities, all those transcendental aspirations, contrary to sense, instinct, nature, and animalism. In short, all past and present ideals, which are all ideals opposed to life, and traducing the world. To whom is one to turn nowadays with such hopes and pretensions? It is just the good men that we should thus bring about our ears. And in addition, as stands to reason, the indolent, the hedgers, the vain, the hysterical, the tired. What is more offensive or more thoroughly calculated to alienate than giving any hint of the exalted severity with which we treat ourselves. And again, how conciliatory, how full of love does all the world show itself towards us as so soon as we do as all the world does, and let ourselves go like all the world. For such a consummation we need spirits of different caliber than seems really feasible in this age, spirits rendered potent through wars and victories, to whom conquest, adventure, danger, even pain have become a need. For such a consummation we need habituation to sharp, rare air, to winter wanderings, to literal and metaphorical ice and mountains. We even need a kind of sublime malice, a supreme and most self-conscious insolence of knowledge, which is the appanage of great health. We need, to summarize the awful truth, just this great health. Is this even feasible today? But some day, in a stronger age than this rotting and introspective present, must he in sooth come to us, even the Redeemer of great love and scorn, the creative spirit rebounding by the impetus of his own force back again, away from every transcendental plane and dimension, he whose solitude is misunderstanded of the people, and though it were a flight from reality, and while actually it is only his diving, burrowing, and penetrating into reality, so that when he comes up again into the light he can at once bring about by these means the redemption of this reality, its redemption from the curse which the old ideal has laid upon it. This man of the future, who in this wise will redeem us from the old ideal, as he will from that ideal's necessary corollary of great nausea,